Representative Jasmine Crockett stood at the witness table in the Supreme Court chambers, her emerald green suit crisp against the dark wood paneling, her gaze unwavering as she faced the 9 justices before her. The chamber buzzed with tension, journalists' pens poised over notepads, phones recording every moment of this historic hearing on judicial ethics. C-SPAN cameras positioned strategically around the room captured each facial expression, every subtle reaction that would soon be dissected by millions across America. Just moments earlier, Justice Samuel Alito had cut her off mid-sentence with a dismissive wave of his hand, his voice dripping with condescension. "Congresswoman Crockett," he'd said, leaning forward with narrowed eyes, the microphone amplifying his words throughout the chamber. "You're clearly out of your depth on constitutional matters. Perhaps stick to simple district issues that you can comprehend." The chamber had gasped collectively, the words hanging in the air like a slap. Several justices shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Justice Sotomayor's eyes widened in surprise. Justice Kagan stared downward, seemingly embarrassed by her colleague's tone, and Justice Jackson subtly shook her head in apparent disapproval. Chief Justice Roberts looked visibly stunned at his colleague's breach of decorum, his hand tightening around his pen as he contemplated whether to intervene. Crockett, the former civil rights attorney and rising Democratic star, didn't flinch. Instead, she straightened her spine, adjusted her microphone, and prepared to respond. The 44-year-old Harvard Law graduate had faced down tougher opponents in Texas courtrooms and on the House floor. But this was different. This was the highest court in the land, and Alito had just made the mistake of publicly underestimating her before millions of Americans watching the televised hearing. In that crystallizing moment, with cameras capturing every nuance, Crockett saw not just a personal insult, but an opportunity to expose what she believed was the arrogance that had led to the ethics crisis enveloping the court. She took a measured breath, her mind racing through relevant precedents and constitutional principles. This wasn't just about defending her intelligence. It was about defending the integrity of the institution itself. As the silence stretched, tension building, Crockett prepared to turn Alito's condescension into the greatest mistake of his 18-year Supreme Court career. Her eyes briefly met those of Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, seated just behind her, who gave an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. Several rows back, Crockett's former law professor watched intently. Remembering the brilliant student who had never backed down from intellectual challenges, even when facing the most established scholars on campus. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary confrontation, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so you never miss our latest political analysis and breaking coverage of Washington's most dramatic moments. Now, let's return to that electrifying scene in the Supreme Court and what led to this unprecedented showdown. The grand chamber of the Supreme Court had never been designed for confrontation. Its mahogany benches, marble columns, and solemn atmosphere were meant to elevate deliberation above the partisan fray. Yet on this Thursday morning, those traditional boundaries were crumbling before the nation's eyes. Justice Samuel Alito, 74, sat with the quiet confidence of a man who had wielded enormous power for nearly 2 decades on the bench. His narrow face, with deep-set eyes behind rimless glasses, projected an intensity that had made him a hero to constitutional originalists and a formidable force in the court's conservative majority. The son of an Italian immigrant father, Alito had risen through Princeton, Yale Law, and the Reagan Justice Department before his 2006 confirmation to the nation's highest court. Known for his sharp questioning and unwavering conservative positions, he rarely disguised his impatience with arguments he considered flawed. His judicial opinions had reshaped American law on issues from reproductive rights to religious liberty, often with a characteristic certainty that brooked no compromise. Colleagues on the court sometimes privately referred to his Alito tone, the unmistakable edge his voice took when he believed someone was wasting the court's time with arguments he considered intellectually deficient. That tone had been on full display moments earlier when addressing Congresswoman Crockett. Recently, however, Alito had become the center of growing controversy. Ethics reporters had uncovered evidence of undisclosed luxury trips funded by conservative billionaires, a Confederate flag flying at his vacation home, and his wife's participation in January 6th related social media activity. These revelations had triggered this unprecedented congressional hearing on Supreme Court ethics reform, a hearing that clearly irritated the justice who believed deeply in the court's independence from political oversight. Seated at the witness table, Representative Jasmine Crockett represented everything that challenged Alito's worldview. At 44, the freshman congresswoman from Texas had already established herself as one of the Democratic Party's most effective communicators. Before entering politics, she had built her reputation as a civil rights attorney defending Black Lives Matter protesters and fighting voter suppression. Her election to Congress had been heralded as part of a new generation of leadership. Young, black, female, and unwilling to accept the Washington status quo. Crockett's questioning had been precise and relentless, drawing on her legal background to highlight the absence of binding ethics rules for Supreme Court justices. The American people deserve to know that decisions affecting their fundamental rights aren't being influenced by undisclosed gifts or political entanglements. She had said moments before Alito's dismissive comment, "Every federal judge in America follows a code of conduct, except the 9 who make the most consequential decisions. The stakes couldn't be higher." This wasn't merely a clash of personalities, but a battle over institutional power and accountability. For Alito, it was about preserving the Supreme Court's independence and traditional status above political oversight. For Crockett, it was about ensuring equal justice under law by holding even the most powerful accountable to the same standards as everyone else. Chief Justice Roberts, sensing the dangerous territory they had entered, attempted to regain control. "Congressman Crockett, perhaps we should redirect to the specific proposals before—" But Alito interrupted his chief. "With all due respect, I believe I have the right to respond to what amounts to an accusation against my integrity." His voice carried the practiced control of decades on the bench, but a slight tremor of anger vibrated beneath. Crockett's eyes remained fixed on Alito, unflinching. Her years fighting in Texas courtrooms had taught her to recognize when an opponent was making a critical mistake. Alito's condescension had just opened a door that decades of judicial restraint had kept firmly closed, and she was prepared to walk through it with the Constitution itself as her guide. The gallery grew perfectly still, reporters leaning forward as the Congresswoman prepared to respond to a direct insult from a Supreme Court justice, something unprecedented in modern court history. And behind this dramatic personal confrontation lay the future of the institution itself. Would the Supreme Court remain the last branch of government without enforceable ethics rules? Or was this the moment when that would finally change? "Justice Alito," Crockett began, her voice measured, yet carrying clearly through the chamber. "I appreciate your concern about my understanding of constitutional matters. Perhaps we could test that together." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a well-worn copy of the Constitution, its pages marked with colorful tabs. Article 3 establishes the Supreme Court, but nowhere does it exempt justices from ethical standards that apply to every other federal judge. Alito's expression hardened. "Congresswoman, the Constitution provides for the separation of powers. Congress cannot simply impose—" "I'm familiar with separation of powers, Justice Alito," Crockett interrupted smoothly, causing a ripple of murmurs through the gallery. "That same principle requires checks and balances. Would you agree that no branch should be completely unaccountable?" The gallery erupted in hushed conversations. One veteran Supreme Court reporter whispered to another, "I've never seen anyone interrupt a justice like that." A law student in the back row frantically typed notes on her laptop, recognizing she was witnessing a historic exchange that would likely appear in constitutional law textbooks for decades to come. Before Alito could respond, Justice Elena Kagan leaned forward. "If I may, the issue isn't whether ethics standards should exist, but how they should be implemented." Her intervention seemed calculated to diffuse the tension. But Crockett wasn't about to lose her momentum. "Justice Kagan, I appreciate that perspective." Crockett nodded respectfully before turning back to Alito. "But Justice Alito's suggestion that I'm out of my depth on constitutional matters deserves addressing, especially since I'm inquiring about trips to luxury fishing lodges that somehow didn't appear on financial disclosure forms." The chamber went deadly silent. Crockett had just directly referenced the recent ProPublica investigations into Alito's undisclosed luxury trips with billionaire donors who had interests before the court. Photojournalist's camera clicked rapidly, capturing Alito's expression changing from dismissive confidence to guarded defensiveness, images that would dominate news websites within the hour. Alito's face flushed. Those reports contain significant misrepresentations that I've already addressed in public statements. Yet the facts remain undisputed, Crockett countered. You accepted luxury travel that wasn't disclosed from individuals with interest before the court. My question isn't whether you're an originalist or textualist. It's whether the American people deserve to know who's providing expensive gifts to those deciding their rights. Chief Justice Roberts attempted to intervene again. Congresswoman, this hearing was called to discuss potential reforms, not individual. But Crockett was prepared. She held up a document. I have here the Code of Conduct for United States Judges, which applies to every federal judge, except the 9 sitting before me. Canon 2 states, a judge should avoid impropriety and the appearance of impropriety in all activities. She looked directly at Alito. Would you argue this principle shouldn't apply to Supreme Court justices? The tension in the room ratcheted higher as Alito visibly struggled between institutional restraint and personal defense. The Supreme Court has unique constitutional status. We've maintained our own internal guidelines for over 2 centuries. Internal guidelines, Crockett repeated, her voice carrying a note of incredulity. She turned to address the entire bench. With the greatest respect to this institution, internal guidelines failed to prevent Justice Thomas from accepting millions in undisclosed luxury travel, or Justice Alito from failing to recuse in cases involving January 6th, despite his wife's involvement, or the Confederate flag that flew at your vacation home while the court was hearing affirmative action cases. Gasps echoed through the chamber at this direct reference to the most controversial ethics allegations. Court police shifted nervously as voices rose in the gallery. Justice Brett Kavanaugh, perhaps sensing disaster unfolding, attempted to redirect. Congresswoman Crockett, these are complex matters that the court takes seriously. In fact, just last November, we adopted a formal code of conduct. A code with no enforcement mechanism, Crockett interjected. One that leaves compliance entirely at each justice's discretion. Do you believe that would be sufficient for any other branch of government? The confrontation was spiraling beyond the traditional boundaries of Supreme Court hearings. Journalists furiously took notes, recognizing they were witnessing a historic challenge to judicial impunity. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, known for her direct manner, unexpectedly entered the fray. Congresswoman, speaking only for myself, I believe legitimate questions about court ethics deserve thoughtful answers, not dismissals. That said, congressional oversight must respect separation of powers concerns. Crockett nodded appreciatively at Sotomayor before turning back to Alito. Justice, when you suggested I stick to simple district issues I can comprehend, were you aware I was a practicing attorney handling complex constitutional matters before I entered Congress? Her question hung in the air, highlighting the gendered and possibly racial undertones of Alito's dismissal. Alito's jaw tightened. My comment addressed the substance of your questions, not your background. Then let's address substance, Crockett said, extracting a document from her folder. I have here your majority opinion in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health, where you wrote that rights not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution must be deeply rooted in the nation's history and traditions. She looked up. Yet judicial ethics requirements date back to the founding era, while your novel interpretation of the Constitution removed a right women relied on for 50 years. The public gallery erupted in both applause and angry murmurs, forcing the court-martial to call for order by banging his gavel. This breach of decorum in the normally staid court chamber reflected how Crockett had transformed a routine oversight hearing into a pivotal confrontation over judicial accountability. Alito, his composure slipping, responded with unusual heat. Congresswoman, you're deliberately mischaracterizing both my judicial philosophy and the court's approach to ethics. This performative questioning may play well for cameras, but it disrespects this institution. It was exactly what Crockett had been waiting for, the moment when Alito's frustration would lead him to reveal the very attitude that had created the ethics crisis in the first place. She leaned forward, her voice level but penetrating. Justice Alito, with all due respect, what disrespects this institution is the belief that Supreme Court justices are somehow above the ethical standards that apply to every other federal judge in America. What disrespects this institution is suggesting that a member of Congress, a co-equal branch of government, should stick to simple matters rather than fulfilling her constitutional oversight duty. Crockett paused, letting the words land. Then she reached into her briefcase and withdrew what appeared to be a printed photograph. Mr. Chief Justice, I'd like to enter this into the record and ask Justice Alito about its contents, if I may continue. Chief Justice Roberts, clearly uncomfortable with how the hearing was unfolding but bound by the court's agreement to participate, nodded reluctantly. You may proceed, Congresswoman, but I would remind everyone that this hearing was intended to be a constructive dialogue. Crockett held up the photograph for all to see. It showed a luxury fishing lodge in Alaska, with Justice Alito clearly visible standing beside billionaire Paul Singer, whose hedge fund had repeatedly had cases before the court. Justice Alito, would you agree that the American people deserve to know when a justice accepting luxury travel from someone with business before the court creates at minimum the appearance of impropriety? As Alito stared at the photograph, the cameras captured his expression, shifting from confidence to the dawning realization that he had severely underestimated his opponent. What had begun as a routine oversight hearing had escalated into a defining moment for the court's future, and Crockett was holding documentary evidence that his dismissive attitude could no longer explain away. The photograph remained suspended in Crockett's hand, a silent accusation capturing everyone's attention. For 3 excruciating seconds, Alito stared at the image before finding his voice. That photo lacks context, he finally said, his tone defensive. Mr. Singer was one of many guests at an event I attended in my official capacity. I've already addressed this in my public statement. The slight tremor in his voice did not escape notice. A veteran court reporter from the Washington Post who had covered the justices for 3 decades exchanged a knowing glance with her colleague. In all those years, she had never heard Alito sound quite so defensive. Crockett nodded as if considering his response, then calmly placed the photo down and picked up another document. I have here your financial disclosure forms from 2008 to 2023. Nowhere do these luxury trips appear. Section 5, CFR, Carv 35111, requires federal judges to disclose gifts and travel reimbursements. Exceeding reporting thresholds, the hushed silence in the chamber was broken only by the sound of pages turning as several journalists flipped through their research materials. To verify the regulation Crockett had cited, a legal analyst from a major network silently nodded confirmation to his colleague that the Congresswoman's citation was accurate. She slid the documents forward for the gallery to see. This isn't about your judicial philosophy, Justice Alito. It's about following the same rules that bind every other federal judge. Would you expect a district court judge to remain on a case if they had accepted similar undisclosed gifts from a litigant? Alito's face darkened. The situations are not comparable. Supreme Court recusal standards must consider. Actually, Crockett interjected, 28 U.S. Code, paragraph 455, makes no distinction between Supreme Court justices and other federal judges. It states any justice or judge shall disqualify himself in any proceeding in which his impartiality might reasonably be questioned. A first-year law student seated in the back row whispered to her classmate, "She's citing the exact statute. I just studied this last week in my judicial ethics seminar." Around them, veteran court watchers exchanged glances, recognizing they were witnessing an unprecedented moment in the court's modern history. The chamber fell silent as everyone recognized they were witnessing something unprecedented. A direct, evidence-based challenge to a sitting justice's ethical conduct, delivered by someone he had just publicly dismissed as intellectually inferior. Outside the Supreme Court building, a growing crowd had gathered as news of the confrontation spread through social media. Capitol Hill staffers on lunch break stood alongside tourists and law students, all huddled around smartphones streaming the live hearing. Did she really just call him out like that? Asked a wide-eyed intern from a Senate office. A retired attorney nodded. and with the perfect statutory citation too. This is constitutional history happening in real time. Inside, the air conditioning seemed to strain against the rising temperature in the room as Crockett continued, her voice resonating with clarity. Justice Alito, when you suggested I stick to simple district issues, you revealed precisely the problem we're addressing today. The belief that Supreme Court justices are somehow exempt from standards that apply to everyone else. She turned to address the entire bench. This isn't about politics. It's about the integrity of our highest court. When Justice Thomas accepts millions in undisclosed gifts, when Justice Alito fails to disclose luxury travel from billionaires with cases before the court, when justices refuse to recuse from cases directly affecting their families, the damage isn't just to the individuals, it's to the institution itself. The words echoed through the chamber, landing with the precision of a skilled litigator. Behind the press gallery, sketch artists' pencils moved furiously across paper, capturing the tableau of power being challenged, Crockett standing tall and composed, Alito's face a study in controlled anger. Other justices with expressions ranging from discomfort to thoughtful consideration. These images would appear on front pages across America the following morning. Chief Justice Roberts leaned forward. Congresswoman, these are serious allegations that— They aren't allegations, Mr. Chief Justice, Crockett said respectfully but firmly. They're documented facts reported by multiple credible news organizations and confirmed by the justice's own statements. The question isn't whether these things happened. It's whether the court believes they should continue happening without consequence. She turned to face the entire room, including the press corps. The American people aren't foolish. They understand that when millionaires and billionaires provide luxury vacations, private jet travel, and real estate deals to justices who then rule on their cases, it creates exactly the appearance of impropriety that judicial ethics codes are designed to prevent. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, perhaps sensing the hearing slipping further away from the court's control, attempted to reframe the discussion. Congresswoman Crockett, I think we can all agree that maintaining public confidence in the court's impartiality is essential. The question is how to balance that with the constitutional separation of powers. Crockett nodded appreciatively. Justice Barrett, I completely agree about the importance of separation of powers. That's precisely why checks and balances exist, so no branch becomes unaccountable. She reached into her folder and extracted another document. I have here the House Judiciary, Committee's proposed Supreme Court Ethics and Recusal Reform Act. It doesn't dictate how you decide cases. It simply creates transparency requirements and recusal standards, similar to those already binding on all other federal judges. She held the bill up for the cameras. Nothing in this proposal infringes on judicial independence. It strengthens it by protecting the court from the appearance that justices can be influenced by luxury gifts or political entanglements. Justice Alito, visibly struggling to maintain his composure, cut in. Congresswoman, your characterizations continue to misrepresent both the facts and the constitutional principles at stake. The court has maintained its ethical standards for over 2 centuries without congressional interference. It was exactly the opening Crockett had been waiting for. She reached into her briefcase one final time and withdrew a bound report with the seal of the Congressional Research Service. Justice Alito, I have here the Congressional Research Service's comprehensive analysis of Supreme Court ethics controversies since 1970. She opened to a bookmarked page. It documents 28 significant ethics controversies involving justices from across the ideological spectrum. What's changed isn't congressional oversight. It's the unprecedented scale of undisclosed gifts. Speaking fees, book deals, spousal entanglements, and public partisan activities by sitting justices. She looked directly at Alito, her voice calm but resolute. So when you suggest I'm out of my depth on constitutional matters, I have to wonder, is it because I'm asking questions you don't want to answer? Or because I represent a Congress fulfilling its constitutional duty to provide checks and balances on a court that increasingly acts as if it answers to no one? The chamber fell completely silent. For perhaps the first time in modern court history, a justice had been directly confronted with documented evidence of ethical lapses in a public forum, and by someone he had just attempted to publicly diminish. In that moment, something remarkable happened. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, the newest member of the court, leaned forward. "If I may," she said, her voice measured, "I believe Congresswoman Crockett raises legitimate concerns that deserve thoughtful consideration. While I agree with my colleagues about the importance of judicial independence, transparency and ethical standards strengthen rather than weaken that independence." She looked around the bench. Perhaps this is an opportunity for the court to demonstrate its commitment to those principles by engaging constructively with Congress on reasonable reforms. Jackson's intervention came as a surprise to many observers. As the court's most junior justice, she typically deferred to her more senior colleagues in public settings. But her background as a former public defender and district court judge had given her a unique perspective on judicial accountability. Her words carried additional weight because she had maintained a reputation for careful, measured speech that avoided unnecessary controversy. The chamber buzzed with surprise. The newest justice had just broken ranks in a way that offered the court a path forward while validating Crockett's core argument. Crockett seized the moment. "Justice Jackson, thank you. That's precisely the point. This isn't about controlling how the court decides cases. It's about ensuring Americans can trust that those decisions are based on law and constitution, not on private interests or partisan allegiances." She turned back to Alito, who sat stone-faced. "Justice Alito, when you suggested I stick to simple matters I could comprehend, you unintentionally revealed the heart of this issue. The belief that some are above questioning, above accountability, above the standards that apply to everyone else." Crockett gestured to the gallery filled with ordinary Americans. "These people, the ones whose rights and freedoms depend on your decisions, they deserve to know that the highest court in the land meets the highest ethical standards. Not because Congress demands it, but because justice requires it." The gallery erupted in applause, forcing the marshal to bang his gavel repeatedly for order. The cameras captured the historic moment as Alito sat rigid in his chair, the visual embodiment of an institution facing a reckoning it could no longer avoid. His attempt to dismiss Crockett had backfired spectacularly, transforming what might have been a routine oversight hearing into a pivotal moment in the court's history. As the applause finally subsided, Chief Justice Roberts, recognizing the damage control needed, spoke with deliberate formality. "Congresswoman Crockett, your concerns have been noted. I want to assure you and the American people that this court takes its ethical obligations seriously. While we must protect judicial independence, we also recognize the importance of public confidence in our impartiality." It was as close to a concession as the court had ever made on the ethics issue, and it had come only after Crockett had systematically dismantled Alito's dismissive attitude with evidence, constitutional expertise, and moral clarity. Crockett nodded, recognizing the significance of Roberts' statement. "Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice. I believe this conversation represents exactly how our constitutional system should work, with co-equal branches engaging honestly, even when that engagement is difficult." As she gathered her documents, the cameras captured not just her composed dignity, but also the stark contrast with Alito's rigid discomfort. In attempting to diminish her, he had instead elevated her, and in the process, created the very accountability moment the court had long sought to avoid. The hearing had concluded less than 30 minutes ago, but already the impact was reverberating through Washington and across the nation. As Representative Jasmine Crockett descended the Supreme Court steps, surrounded by colleagues and staff, the gathered press corps erupted with questions. "Congresswoman, did you anticipate Justice Alito's personal attack? Representative Crockett, was this confrontation planned or spontaneous?" A sea of microphones thrust forward as television cameras captured her every expression. Behind her, the historic Supreme Court building loomed large against the bright blue September sky, its marble columns and equal justice under law inscription taking on new significance after the morning's events. Crockett paused, her emerald suit vibrant against the court's white marble backdrop. "I came prepared to discuss serious ethical issues affecting our highest court. Justice Alito's suggestion that I stick to simple matters was unexpected, but it unfortunately demonstrated exactly the attitude that has created this ethics crisis." She adjusted her glasses, looking directly into the forest of cameras. "This isn't about personalities. It's about principles. Every other federal judge follows a binding code of conduct. The 9 justices making our most consequential decisions should too. That's not a radical position. It's common sense. Behind her, the Supreme Court building stood imposing and eternal. But something had fundamentally shifted inside its chambers. For perhaps the first time, a justice had been held publicly accountable for ethical lapses, with evidence he couldn't dismiss. Meanwhile, inside the court, an emergency conference had been hastily convened in the justice's private meeting room. Sources close to the court would later describe the atmosphere as tense and unprecedented. Justice Alito reportedly defended his comments, insisting Crockett had been grandstanding for political gain. But Justice Jackson pushed back, noting that his dismissive treatment had created precisely the confrontation that damaged the court's dignity. Justice Kagan reportedly stressed that the court could no longer ignore the mounting ethics concerns, while the Chief Justice emphasized the urgent need for a unified response to preserve institutional credibility. The discussion became heated at points. A court insider, speaking on condition of anonymity months later to The New Yorker, described Justice Thomas as staunchly defending Alito, suggesting the entire ethics inquiry represented congressional overreach. Justice Barrett reportedly took a more moderate position, acknowledging legitimate concerns while questioning Congress's authority to impose binding rules. Justice Sotomayor, known for her directness, reportedly asked the room a simple question: what are we afraid of? If we have nothing to hide, why resist basic disclosure standards that every other federal judge follows? According to multiple sources, Justice Kavanaugh suggested a compromise position of voluntary reforms to head off congressional action, a proposal that sparked further debate about whether such measures would be sufficient to restore public confidence. As the justices debated behind closed doors, social media exploded. Crockett vs. Alito became the top trending topic nationwide within minutes. The video clip of Alito suggesting Crockett stick to simple matters, juxtaposed with her methodical, evidence-based response, had already been viewed over 3 million times. Conservative media scrambled to defend Alito. Supreme Court under attack, blared the Fox News chyron as commentators decried congressional overreach and disrespect for the court. But even there, some analysts acknowledged Alito's comment had been tactically unwise and created an unnecessary vulnerability. Liberal outlets framed the confrontation as a watershed moment. Crockett exposes court's ethics crisis headlined MSNBC's coverage, while CNN's legal analysts debated whether this marked a turning point for court accountability. Representative Crockett did something remarkable today, said one commentator. She used Alito's own condescension to expose the larger attitude problem at the heart of the court's ethics crisis. Within 2 hours, Alito's insult and Crockett court victory were competing for social media dominance. Users shared clips highlighting the stark contrasts: Alito's dismissive wave versus Crockett's composed citation of legal statutes, his flustered defensiveness against her methodical presentation of evidence. A former clerk to Justice Sotomayor, speaking anonymously to protect relationships, told the Washington Post, "What happened today was unprecedented. Justices are accustomed to tough questioning during oral arguments, but they've never faced direct accountability for their own ethical conduct." Crockett didn't just win the exchange, she fundamentally altered the power dynamic between Congress and the court. By early evening, the White House had entered the conversation. The press secretary, responding to reporters' questions, said, "The president believes in the importance of an independent judiciary and also in the ethical standards that maintain public confidence in our institutions." Congresswoman Crockett raised legitimate concerns that deserve serious consideration. The impact extended beyond Washington. Law schools across the country reported that clips from the hearing were already being incorporated into ethics and constitutional law classes. "This will be taught for generations," said a constitutional law professor at Yale. It's the moment when the court's ethical exceptionalism finally faced a reckoning. The dean of Harvard Law School, where Crockett had earned her J.D. with honors, issued a statement. "Today we witnessed constitutional principles in action. Representative Crockett demonstrated the highest traditions of legal advocacy, thoroughly prepared, evidence-based, and focused on institutional integrity rather than personal attack." Outside the Supreme Court building, Demonstrators began gathering with hastily made signs. "No one above the law and ethics apply to all 9." Appeared alongside "Crockett for AG" and "Thank you for speaking truth to power." Network cameras captured the growing crowd as day turned to evening. The Supreme Court's facade dramatically lit against the darkening sky. Public reaction reflected the nation's polarization, but with a notable difference. Polling conducted in the hearing's immediate aftermath showed 67% of Americans, including 43% of Republicans, agreed with Crockett's central argument that Supreme Court justices should follow the same ethical standards as other federal judges. The personal implications for the confrontation's central figures were equally dramatic. Justice Alito, according to court sources, was furious at how the exchange had unfolded and believed he had been ambushed. But other justices were reportedly concerned that his comments had created precisely the public relations crisis they had hoped to avoid. For Crockett, the impact was transformative. The freshman congresswoman had entered the hearing as a rising Democratic star. She emerged as a national figure who had done what many thought impossible, held a Supreme Court justice directly accountable for ethical lapses with evidence he couldn't dismiss. By nightfall, her office had received calls from every major news organization and invitations to appear on Sunday political shows. Democratic leadership publicly praised her principled stand for judicial accountability, while progressive organizations reported unprecedented donation surges, earmarked for supporting ethics reform. Legal experts began debating the longer-term implications. "This creates a dilemma for the court," explained a judicial ethics scholar. "They can no longer simply dismiss ethics concerns as political attacks, not after Crockett methodically documented the factual basis for those concerns. But acknowledging the legitimacy of congressional oversight opens the door to reforms they've long resisted." The most significant development came shortly before midnight, when Chief Justice Roberts issued a remarkable statement. The Supreme Court takes seriously its ethical obligations and public confidence in the judiciary. In light of today's discussions, I am announcing the formation of a committee to review our current ethics practices and consider potential reforms that maintain judicial independence while ensuring appropriate transparency and accountability. Though carefully worded, the statement represented an unprecedented concession from a court that had previously insisted its internal guidelines were sufficient. Court observers immediately recognized that Roberts would never have taken this step without the pressure created by Crockett's methodical dismantling of Alito's dismissive attitude. As news shows prepared their morning coverage, producers faced a challenge: how to convey the full significance of what had occurred. This wasn't just political theater or a clash of personalities. It was a constitutionally significant moment when the Supreme Court's long-standing immunity from ethical oversight had finally met its match in a freshman congresswoman who refused to be dismissed. The next morning's headlines captured the historic nature of the confrontation. Washington Post: Crockett confronts Alito. Supreme Court ethics crisis reaches boiling point. New York Times: after Alito's dismissal backfires, court signals ethics reform. Wall Street Journal: congressional hearing escalates Supreme Court ethics debate. USA Today: courtroom showdown. Crockett turns Alito's insult into ethics reckoning. Perhaps the most telling response came from ordinary Americans across the country. A retired teacher in Ohio told a local reporter, "I've never seen anything like it." She just calmly laid out the facts while he got more and more defensive. Made me think maybe these justices aren't above the law after all. A law student in California posted a viral TikTok. Crockett just showed every woman and person of color what to do when powerful men tell you you're out of your depth. Come with receipts and flip the script for the Supreme Court, an institution that had long operated above the political fray. The confrontation marked a pivotal moment. The question was no longer whether ethics reform would happen, but what form it would take and how much control the court would maintain over the process. For Jasmine Crockett, the freshman congresswoman who had entered the hearing as one voice among many, the path forward was clear. As she told reporters gathering outside her office the next morning, "Yesterday wasn't about winning an argument with Justice Alito. It was about winning the argument for judicial accountability. No one in America is above ethical standards. Not even the 9 justices who determine our rights and freedoms." She paused, then added the line that would define this historic confrontation. "Justice Alito told me to stick to simple matters I could comprehend. But there's nothing complicated about this principle. Equal justice under law means those who judge must meet the highest standards of all." As the story continues to unfold, one thing remains certain. What began as an insult transformed into a turning point for the Supreme Court's relationship with ethical accountability. The institution that decides America's most consequential cases now faces a consequential reckoning of its own, all because a justice underestimated a congresswoman who came prepared not just with outrage, but with evidence. This confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and Samuel Alito will be studied in law schools, political science classes, and media studies programs for generations to come. A textbook example of how preparation, composure, and moral clarity can transform an insult into a historic victory for accountability. If you found this breakdown of the Crockett-Alito confrontation valuable, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. We bring you in-depth analysis of Washington's most consequential moments and the key figures shaping America's future. Hit the notification bell to never miss our latest videos on Supreme Court developments, congressional showdowns, and the ongoing battle for America's democratic institutions.